African stories by Africans. Africa, certainly we know, is not a village.
We tell it in our own way, on our own terms.
Film festivals for African cinema.
These images of Africa, instead of some of the images that we've been seeing, it really helps with cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity and things that are really important.
Africa, world's largest and most populous continent with about 1.2 billion people on its surface. A shell from which research has shown mankind evolved from. A land which suffers amidst plenty but has thrived through the lingering memoirs of a painful past. A soil I am truly proud to be a daughter of. Traveling the world and coming to the United States especially truly has opened my inner eyes to the realities Africans in diaspora face, trying to redefine their identities, rewrite their stories, and change how the diaspora perceives them as individuals or a collective group of people. Growing up in the city of Lagos, Nigeria, West Africa, I had been fed with stories from the outside world about who I was as an African and a Nigerian. For years, Africans on the continent and in the diaspora have created their own platforms and forums through which their stories could be told, preserved, and better appreciated. This has ignited an inferno of African film festivals at home and in the diaspora especially. The Silicon Valley African Film Festival is one of such, and I was at this year's edition to experience the feeling of home and feed my curiosity on the African storytelling trend and the impact this will have on the industry, the continent, and my brothers and sisters at home and in the diaspora.
Africans that were born and raised in Africa, when they come out to the West, will recognize. When I arrived in the United States over 20 years ago, it was shocking to me to see and experience the kind of information people had about Africa, the place that I call home. There was just ignorance everywhere I looked, on television, in the magazines, in the newspapers. There was a certain Tarzan view of Africa, as if everybody on the continent of Africa still lived in caves. And it's not funny, because this was really what the perception was. There's this National Geographic narration about Africa, that people thought Africa was just the place for desolation and desperation and poverty and sickness and all. And so these were the kinds of images that I kept encountering about this continent, where I come from, where I know, and I never could recognize the images of my continent outside of my continent. And this never stopped. And so as I continued my career in corporate America and moved on to teach at the university here in the Silicon Valley, I began to bring in films by Africans into my classrooms. And my students were fascinated when they saw contemporary stories of young people falling in love and going to the nightclub, driving, seeing the city. A lot of them were really perplexed that these images were really coming from Africa. Because in spite of the fact that they were in college, a lot of them didn't have that exposure of Africa as a place where you had downtowns and high-rise buildings and those kinds of things. It began to nudge at me, it began to make me understand that perhaps image of Africa could be presented by the Africans in a way that is respectful of the continent and true to the continent. And I must say, those kinds of things were the things that led and became the perfect storm. And hence, 7 years ago, I decided that we should do something about it, and we did. And we hosted the very first in the series that have now become 7 series of this thing called the Silicon Valley African Film Festival.
Well, the African film industry had its challenges, right from the get-go, with respect to funding or even respect or recognition with the various governments. But for the relentlessness of the filmmakers, things have changed. There are now various thresholds, various areas, and various developments that augur well overall for the film industry. There are many more films being made, There are much younger filmmakers, and they are exploring various genres, various stories, various aspects of African, cultural heritage and contemporary realities. So all those mean well for African filmmaking.
I was very impressed with what I found out about Nollywood, and that it's the third largest film industry in the world, and all the amazing content and all the creativity that's coming out of the entire continent of Africa, not just in Nollywood, but all over. And they're heartwarming stories, they're fun, fascinating stories, and I think it's really important to see these images of Africa instead of some of the images that we've been seeing. It really helps with cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity and things that are really important.
So I think African films are important, especially the films made by African filmmakers, because we know that when industries like Hollywood make films about Africa, it's always portrayed in a very allegoric way, not true. And we see an Africa that's not really real. So I think festivals like the Silicon Valley African Film Festival is doing a great job.
I think now we're getting there. Some years back, we could only maybe hear about a few movies, especially in Nigeria, South Africa. But now several countries have come in. We talk of Ghana, talk of Burkina Faso, you talk of Tanzania, Zambia. So yeah, the industry now is really coming up.
It's booming, and I find that really exciting. I think digital technology has really democratized filmmaking, and so people anywhere in the world can just kind of take the tools and tell their own stories, and a lot of that is happening in Africa. And the other really exciting thing, when I was growing up in Ghana, I was aware of Nollywood and its production of films, but the other exciting thing is the boom of film festivals for African cinema. They're happening in Europe, they're happening in America, they're happening on the continent. And so the combination of production and exhibition platforms is really exciting.
This year's edition featured over 55 submissions from 25 African countries, a feat that truly set a colorful tone for the three-day event. This year's festival had a new touch to it. The Diaspora Spotlight centerpiece was featured to honor and celebrate Africa's ancestral footprints in a country or region of African diaspora through films, exhibitions, performances, and panel discussions. This year, the spotlight was on Brazil.
This is the first year that the Silicon Valley African Film Festival creates a spotlight on the diaspora, and it couldn't have been another country to start the spotlight, because Brazil has the largest population of African descendants in the world. We are over 200 million inhabitants, and of this population, over 50 million are of African descent. So it's very important that we have this spotlight here today, because Brazil also has a very big piece of Africa. And I'm so glad I'm coming from a home city called Salvador, where the 80% of the population are African descendants.
So the first country in our Diaspora Spotlight program is Brazil. And we've opened up a window in our program for Brazil, a wonderful panel of Brazilians discussing Brazil, race, identity, and place. And wonderful collection of 7 films from Brazil. Opening up the Diaspora program with a beautiful Brazilian martial arts demonstration called Capoeira. And so these are the kinds of progressive stuff that we're doing to expand the impact of our film festival, to engage broader communities and audiences.
It's always like, a stretch to ensure that we are heard, to ensure that we get recognition, to ensure that our causes are also be, in the narrative. So, but I think it's really important, the work that Eliana, for example, is doing, which is like try to educate kids and the whole education system. The work that Elisiana and Carolina are also doing in terms of like creating awareness of our cultures.
Carnival is the, I'll try to summarize this as Carnival is the worst maybe the biggest representation of racism in Brazil, because you have a parade, you have a bloco with a choir system playing, a band playing at the top, and then there is like a cord to protect all the white and rich people that have access to pay $3,000 to access that area to drink and dance and have fun. And then around the place, there is a large amount of black people selling beers, catering to the rich people who are having fun. So I really don't like Carnival. You really don't like. So it is unfortunately it's that's the reality.
Find this does, it opens up the conversation of the culture of Africa, because as we see the films, as we see a different way of living, we ask questions. And my fashion, my designs, has the Eastern influence to it, and also infusing the African culture. So when we're bringing fabrics from different parts of Africa, we can give the information on where it comes from, how it's made, and just really opening up that space for conversation and dialogue.
These films give Africans a chance to see themselves. And it gives Africans a chance to, like I said earlier, to tell their own stories. In the past you'd have foreigners telling our stories, but this time around we have the tools to create the stories that we understand.
I think African films is creating a great and huge impact. The filmmakers who are bringing their films here is very important because they're creating history. They are showing what's happening in a country. They're telling their stories. And these stories are going to be saved. And kids, when they grow up, they'll be able to see how their country was before in the past, as created by the hands and the perspective of people from their community.
You can't preserve something you haven't defined or that's been misdefined by other people. So I'm particularly excited in the cinema that I'm creating to raise questions, to get us to think about who we are, where we're going, where we've been, in new and interesting ways.
Well, you'd be surprised, though, the African diaspora, is very, very, they are invested in lots of ways to the development of African filmmaking, for plenty of reasons, in terms of technology. And it's not just about looking back from where once came. There was this clip I saw sometime about first generation, black British kids, doing a azonto, or dancing to flavor or whatever, somewhere. And they don't necessarily have to know what hip life is or how do I say, high life. But I mean, the key thing is this. The African diaspora, for plenty of reasons, are important, in terms of the transfer of knowledge, in terms of keeping certain ideas and ideals of home alive.
This is something to be so proud of. The films that are coming out of Africa could be such a great source of pride. I think it could educate people here in the States and all over the world, really, about Africa and how enormous it is, and how many different cultures are in Africa, and what people are going through in the different nations of Africa, and how similar the stories are to ours in many cases.
Well, there are just so many opportunities for our festival. We have barely begun to scratch the surface of what we are capable of doing. Our festival has grown over the years. We've introduced and continue to introduce programs. One of the things that we've created in the course of these 7 years is our school time series, and that we call Africa in the Classroom film series. And so we are now opening up the library of films that we have to high schools and colleges and middle schools for them to pick through our film collections and relate them to curricula. And this has become a very effective community engagement program for us.
It was indeed a beautiful experience. I couldn't have been more thrilled at the amazing stories, talent and intellect born out of the African continent. The vast richness of the African continent through the lenses of Africa's seasoned and emerging filmmakers can truly be overemphasized. Africa is indeed here to stay.
400 years ago. 400 years ago. They took away my forefathers. They took away my forefathers. From Africa to America.